You know those stories we keep buried for years trying to forget, but every now and then they resurface as if they happened just yesterday. Some experiences leave such a deep mark that no matter how much time passes, it's impossible to erase them. This is one of those stories. Good evening, Dom. I finally gathered the courage to share with you an extremely distressing and unsettling experience I lived through a few years ago. For a long time I avoided talking about it because it still affects me deeply, but I believe it's worth telling. I prefer not to reveal my name, but I'm 55 years old, and at the time I was 42. I'm Mexican and moved to the United States when I turned 30. Since then, I spent years working in various fast food chains until an acquaintance recommended a job opportunity that offered a much better salary. The work was tougher, but in this country, there are no easy options. It was a job at a modest 3-star hotel that needed staff for general services. I applied, and almost immediately, I was hired. The hotel had only 5 floors and was far from luxurious. In fact, it was already showing signs of age and looked somewhat run down. At first, the routine was exhausting, but over time, I adapted. I became friends with the other 2 janitors and a few housekeepers, all of whom were also of Hispanic origin. One night I was cleaning the hallway on the top floor. I swept first, then mopped, just as I always did. I was working while listening to music on my headphones when, suddenly, I noticed a young man stepping out of his room speaking to me. I took off my headphones and walked over to him. Moments later, a young woman appeared at the door as well. They were an American couple, and judging by their irritated tone, they had lost their patience. In English, they asked me to talk to the guests in the next room because they were persistently banging on the walls. They said they had already complained out loud, but instead of stopping, the noise seemed to get worse. I apologized on behalf of the hotel and explained that I was just the janitor but would inform the front desk so they could take action. They thanked me and went back inside. I grabbed the radio we used for communication and reported the complaint to the receptionist. She asked for the room number, and when I told her, I got an unexpected response. That room was vacant. No guests were registered there that night. I insisted, explaining that the couple was certain the noise was coming from that room. Just then, the young man stepped back into the hallway and asked me to come into their room so I could hear it for myself. The banging was loud, and there was no doubt it was coming from the room next door, the one that, according to the receptionist, was supposed to be empty. I reported the situation again, and she told us to wait for security to check it out. A short while later, the security guard arrived and unlocked the door with the master key. As we stepped inside and turned on the lights, the room was spotless, as if no one had ever been there. The bed was neatly made, the bathroom was clean, everything exactly as the housekeepers had left it. We searched the room, checked under the bed and inside the bathroom. Then, when we opened the small closet, something caught my attention. A large black suitcase, looking completely out of place. I alerted the security guard, who pulled it out of the closet. He said it felt heavy. We tilted it and began unzipping it. At that moment, I had the strongest feeling that I shouldn't be there. As soon as the zipper ran all the way around, I saw something I will never forget. Inside the suitcase was a human torso, perfectly severed. I ran out without a second thought and rushed to the bathroom, barely holding back my nausea. Meanwhile, the security guard was already calling the police. Within minutes, the hotel was evacuated. Not many guests were there that night, but everyone was removed because the place had become a crime scene. I had to stay to give my statement when the officers arrived. One of them asked the security guard to check the surveillance footage. Later, I found out what it revealed. A hooded man, dressed in black, had entered through the hotel's back entrance. He was carrying that heavy suitcase and took it straight to the room, leaving it there early in the morning without anyone noticing. The most bizarre and unsettling detail was how long he stayed, no more than 3 minutes. He simply walked in, dropped the suitcase, and left without looking back. The investigators were never able to explain the noises the guests had heard that night, those relentless, disturbing sounds coming from the supposedly empty room. And they never found out. To this day, the person responsible for this atrocity has never been identified. Yes, the victim was eventually identified, a man whose name I prefer not to disclose out of respect, but the rest of his body was never found. This experience left a deep scar on me. What haunts me the most is the possibility that the sounds we heard that night were, in some way, that man trying to be found. I couldn't bear the thought of staying there and resigned shortly after. The hotel is still operating. I don't know if anyone there knows about this story or if they chose to bury it in silence. But just thinking that guests sleep in that room, unaware of what happened inside, sends chills down my spine. Thank you to anyone who listened. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. Hi Dom, I hope you're having a good day. Before anything else, I want to make it clear that I share this story with deep respect for the victim. My only goal is to show that events like this are more common than we imagine. My name is Alessandro. I'd rather not reveal my last name, but for many years I worked as a janitor at a general hospital in my city. It wasn't an easy job. The routine was intense, and the cleaning workload was enormous, as you can imagine. I had already gotten used to seeing all kinds of situations. Sometimes my job was to take care of the morgue, cleaning the space between the bodies. Even though it was a heavy atmosphere, over time, you learn to deal with it. I always had the habit of addressing them with respect, apologizing before I started sweeping and mopping. It was my way of showing dignity, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was past midnight, my shift was over, but I still needed to take out all the trash that had accumulated during the shift. The dumpsters were in the back of the hospital, an isolated area where hardly anyone passed by, especially at that hour. The lighting there was poor, with only one working bulb. I always carried a flashlight because the light barely reached that corner. I was walking slowly, carrying a heavy trash bag, when an unexpected sound made me stop. It was a baby crying. The sound seemed to be coming from the dumpsters, and at that moment, my body froze. Terrified, I imagined what I might find inside. My heart started racing. I dropped the trash bag and, gripping the flashlight tightly, cautiously moved closer. As I got closer, I started searching for the source of the crying. There were 4 dumpsters in that area. I opened them one by one, but all I found were plastic bags and hospital waste. The sound continued, and at that moment I knew I would have to get inside the dumpsters to look for the baby. The idea of doing that alone terrified me, so I ran back to the hospital to get help. At the entrance, I told the first nurses I found, and we quickly rushed back to check the dumpsters together. But when we got there, the crying had stopped. Panic took over me. What if, in the time I wasted getting help, the baby had run out of air? I didn't even know how long it had been in there. With extreme caution, we started going through the trash, determined to find it. That's when a young man who was volunteering at the hospital shouted, "I found it!" But something about his expression unsettled me. It was a mix of shock and frustration. We climbed out of the dumpsters and ran toward him. That's when we saw it. He was holding a baby, but the tiny body was purplish, showing no signs of life. The shock was immediate. The nurses who were there quickly examined the child and said that the baby had been dead for at least 10 hours. There was no possible way it could have cried as I had described. At that moment, my mind collapsed. I was absolutely sure of what I had heard. How else would I have known there was a baby there? But faced with what I was seeing, I simply couldn't say anything. I just stood there motionless, trying to understand the impossible. Later, they wrapped the baby in a blanket and took it inside. There, they confirmed that it had been lifeless for 11 hours. The autopsy revealed that the cause of death was asphyxiation inside the trash. The case became even more tragic when days later they identified the mother, a 15-year-old girl who had given birth at that very hospital. As soon as she was discharged, she was the one who discarded the baby in the dumpsters. I was never able to convince the nurses that I had really heard that cry. Some believed me, especially those who had already experienced things that were hard to explain. I prefer to think that the baby wanted to be found and somehow made its cry heard at the moment I was there. And in case there's any doubt, there was no other baby that could have been responsible for that sound. That same night, they decided to empty all the dumpsters and thoroughly checked for any other children. There were none. That baby was the only one, and at the very least that little angel had a dignified burial. But what happened that night marked me in a way I will never forget. Good evening, everyone. Today I want to share with you a story that belonged to my father, who is no longer with us. He worked for many years as a janitor at a funeral home, a job that gave him countless memories and some peculiar stories that he loved to tell me and my sister. He always said that the most important thing was to keep an open mind. Not everyone has the sensitivity or the opportunity to see certain things, but that doesn't mean they don't happen around us. That's why I want to share this story exactly as he would have told it, in the first person, because I know he would love to be here narrating it himself. I hope you enjoy it. My name is Paulo, but everyone calls me Paco. I was a janitor at a funeral home that served an upper-middle-class clientele in my city. Sometimes I spent long hours there, especially when I had to make sure everything was spotless for the wakes that would take place during the night or the next morning. One of those nights when the place was almost empty, only 2 receptionists and I remained, finishing the last tasks of the day, a family walked in through the main entrance. There were 4 of them, a couple, a little girl no older than 4, and an elderly man. The parents went straight to the reception to talk to the attendants. The man's face was streaked with tears, clearly devastated by the loss of a loved one. Meanwhile, the little girl and her grandfather walked hand in hand around the reception area. The scene touched me. The girl was holding a doll and playing with her grandfather, giving that moment a touch of tenderness amidst the sorrow. They sat on the steps leading to the second floor, continuing their play, while the parents were still busy at the reception. I needed to finish sweeping the entrance, so I passed near them with my cleaning supplies. As I approached, I tried to greet the elderly man with a nod, but he didn't react. Instead, it was the little girl who smiled at me. Suddenly, without warning, the girl started crying and reached out her arms to her grandfather, begging him to pick her up. But he, visibly uncomfortable, just kept repeating that he couldn't. He tried to soothe her, but she cried louder and louder. That's when the mother returned, picked the girl up in her arms and carried her away, even as she kept crying, calling out for her grandfather. The man remained there, standing on the staircase. I finished my work and got ready to leave. The family was still there when I left to get some rest. The next morning, when I returned to work, the funeral home was busy. A funeral was about to take place, and I soon recognized the little girl's parents among those present. However, neither the girl nor the grandfather were there. My colleague from the morning shift, Monica, mentioned that the deceased's body was about to arrive. The staff was already arranging the flowers and preparing the area where the coffin and the portrait would be placed. We needed to carry the final floral arrangements to the hall. After helping with the flowers, I thought we were done when Monica called me to fetch the framed photo of the deceased, which was outside. The frame was large and heavy, so I went to help her without giving it much thought. But when I saw the image in the portrait, a chill ran down my spine. I froze completely. The photo showed the same elderly man who had been there the night before, the same one who held the little girl's hand, the same grandfather she had cried for, asking to be held. Yes, the man I had seen that night was already dead. Monica noticed my expression and asked if I knew the man in the photo. I just shook my head and told her not to worry. I didn't want to say anything at that moment so as not to scare her. Without exchanging another word, we held the frame together and carried it to the hall. After that, I went to the maintenance area where the cleaning supplies were kept, along with a table and chairs that the janitors used during breaks. I sat there for a long time, trying to process everything that had happened. A little while later, Monica appeared. She knew me well, we had worked together for years, and she could tell something was wrong. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I needed to share it with someone, and I trusted her and I told her everything. She listened attentively, and instead of looking scared, her expression was a mix of surprise and emotion. After a few seconds of silence, she said, "He came to say goodbye to his granddaughter." Those words completely changed the way I saw the situation. Suddenly, fear gave way to a melancholic sadness, and at the same time, a sense of warmth. I realized that the little girl was the only one in the family who could see him. And somehow, for some reason I couldn't explain, I could too. As I left the room, I saw that the coffin had already been placed in the hall and the ceremony with the priest had begun. Many people were crying, especially the little girl's parents. But she wasn't there. They had probably decided it was best not to bring her. As the priest delivered his prayer, I noticed that a large screen began displaying photos of the deceased, images filled with moments shared with family and friends. And in many of them, there he was with his granddaughter, holding her tiny hands to help her take her first steps, smiling beside her, sharing moments that now seemed even more meaningful. At that moment, I felt a lump in my throat. I couldn't hold back a tear. Well, that's my father's story. I hope you liked it. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to leave a like. It really makes a difference. Okay, let's continue. A friend of mine worked as a janitor at a university for years. One night, as he finished cleaning the restrooms and was about to end his shift, he heard the sound of a toilet flushing. He found it odd, but didn't give it much thought and continued with his tasks. About 30 minutes later, as he was locking up a classroom, he caught a movement in the hallway from the corner of his eye. Something, or someone, seemed to be moving quickly between the rooms. Without hesitation, he walked over to ensure the building was empty. He searched the area and, finding no signs of an intruder, went back to work as if nothing had happened. Whether it was experience or just steady nerves, he didn't let it shake him. As he passed by the restroom again, a sudden loud bang echoed from inside, like one of the stall doors had been violently struck. Unease settled in. Up until then, he had only noticed isolated noises, nothing that intense. But what truly made him shudder was hearing once again the toilet flushing by itself. Even as chills ran down his spine, he stepped inside to check, and as expected, there was no one there. For the rest of his shift, he had the strange sensation of being watched. The atmosphere felt different, heavy with something he couldn't quite explain. Though he had always been a skeptic, he started to wonder if his mind was playing tricks on him. But doubt turned into unease when he left the building. As he reached the parking lot and turned to take one last look at the university, he saw, in one of the highest windows, the silhouette of a motionless figure standing there for a few seconds before vanishing suddenly. Though he stayed at the job for a few more years, that was the only time something like that ever happened. I spent some time working as a janitor at a mid-range hotel in the city where I live. My responsibilities didn't include cleaning the rooms, but rather common areas like the reception, the lobby restrooms, and the small restaurant. Because of that, my routine was almost always restricted to the ground floor. My shift varied, and on some occasions I finished work around 2 in the morning. Since the area around the hotel was practically deserted at that hour, the street took on a slightly unsettling atmosphere. Even so, I remember one particular night when I went outside to take out the trash and, taking advantage of the moment, stayed outside for a few minutes smoking. After a while, I went back inside as usual. Everything seemed to proceed without incident, but an uneasy feeling lingered while I was out there, as if a part of me was trying to warn me about some invisible danger. However, nothing around me indicated any real threat. No suspicious sounds, no unusual movement. I ended up ignoring it and went on with my work. My night ended without any abnormalities, and I went home. The next day, as soon as I arrived at the hotel, the security guard called me over for a conversation. Not understanding the reason, I followed him to the room where the camera monitors were located. He explained that he had noticed something strange in one of the recordings, and that when they reviewed the footage, they were in for a big surprise. The hotel's trash area was in an alley shared with the building next door, with no barriers preventing outsiders from accessing it. The only security measure was the hotel's back door, which could only be opened from the inside, and that had always been enough to prevent any problems. However, that night, the cameras recorded something unusual. The footage showed exactly what I remembered. I went out, disposed of the trash, lit a cigarette, and lingered there for a few moments. Then, I turned to head back inside. At that exact moment, something emerged from the darkest part of the alley and moved quickly toward me. The video quality wasn't good enough to make out any details, just a dark silhouette approaching and stopping right behind me. The moment I stepped into the building, the figure melted back into the darkness. A chill ran down my spine as I watched, my first assumption being that it could have been someone with bad intentions, perhaps a mugger, or someone under the influence of drugs, waiting for the right moment to act. Without saying anything, the security guard fast-forwarded the footage to the next morning. What I saw left me completely unsettled. I had been waiting the whole time for that figure to leave, to walk away, anything that would confirm its presence. But the video clearly showed that after I entered the hotel, there was no one left in the alley. I have no explanation for what happened that night. The security guard almost reported the incident, but after reviewing the footage multiple times, they concluded that, apparently, there was nothing there. Since then, I've avoided taking out the trash at that hour, and when I have to, I make sure I'm not alone. That was, without a doubt, something I wish I had never witnessed. It was my first week working at a higher education institution. I had worked in similar places before, and although some carried stories of hauntings, I had never witnessed anything that made me take such reports seriously until that day. I remember it was still relatively early, around 7 in the evening, and the sun was setting slowly. Despite that, the university was already completely empty. Professors and students had left the building hours ago, creating an unsettling atmosphere, as if the silence carried something that shouldn't be there. As I climbed to the second floor, I immediately noticed a light on in one of the rooms, the science and medicine laboratory. My first reaction was to assume that someone had forgotten to turn it off before leaving, which went against one of the basic rules there. Slightly annoyed, I decided to go and switch it off. As I walked down the hallway, a strange sound reached my ears. Footsteps. But they weren't normal footsteps. The noise didn't resemble the impact of shoes on the floor, nor the soft glide of bare feet. They sounded rigid, as if something was being dragged by a hard plastic sole. I found it odd, but figured there might still be a professor or student around, so I kept walking. When I was almost at the door, another sound made me stop. Something had moved inside the room, a chair being dragged, as if someone had accidentally bumped into it. Then, I heard those strange footsteps again. After that, absolute silence. The discomfort started turning into unease. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response. I walked a little further until I finally reached the entrance. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was empty. Everything seemed in place except for a chair slightly pulled away from the professor's desk. But then, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. In the corner of the room, the anatomical skeleton used for study was moving. Not abruptly, but as if it had just been pushed and was now slowly returning to its normal position following inertia. I didn't stay to analyze it. I just reached out, turned off the light, and hurried down the stairs, certain that I no longer wanted to spend time on that floor. Days later, while talking to someone from the kitchen staff, I mentioned what had happened. Their reaction was concerning. They became serious and told me that this type of report was nothing new. According to stories circulating among staff and students, that skeleton frequently moved on its own, made strange noises, and on some occasions seemed to follow people with its gaze. I continued working there for a few more months. I never witnessed anything like that again, but every time I had to clean that room, an inexplicable discomfort took over me. I can't say exactly what it was, but that skeleton carried something that simply didn't feel right. My occupation is that of a janitor in an apartment complex managed by a local company here in the state of Kentucky, United States. Although I'm not a nurse, I have basic training in first aid and cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which allows me to handle emergencies that may arise among the residents. Currently, I'm also taking some additional courses to expand my ability to assist in situations that require quick interventions. A large part of my activities involves keeping the common areas in order, replacing burnt-out light bulbs in the hallways, taking care of the gardens, and occasionally helping residents who have difficulty carrying groceries or dealing with small everyday needs. In certain situations, I also accompany them to medical appointments, as the building's management values a close and helpful relationship between the staff and the residents. The story I'm about to share has been altered just enough to protect the privacy of everyone involved, but I can assure you that the essential events are real. About 3 months ago, I began interacting with a new resident, Jonas Harlow. When I checked his records, I found out he was 55 years old and had been born without his right arm. However, that was not the condition that most compromised his health at the moment. Jonas was facing the advanced stages of liver failure due to years of severe alcoholism. His condition was delicate, and my supervisor commented that he probably wouldn't be around very long in the building, a term they used to designate residents who were only waiting for a transfer to a palliative care unit or a specialized facility. He already had regular visits from a nurse who assisted him twice a week. My role was to ensure that his routine in the apartment proceeded without major difficulties, helping with his groceries, preparing quick meals when necessary, keeping the essential rooms clean, and checking to make sure he could move around safely inside the building. I went by 3 times a week to make sure everything was in order. From our very first contact, I felt a certain sympathy for Jonas. His sense of humor was marked by subtle irony, and despite the melancholy that always seemed to hover around him, he showed himself to be a kind person. Our conversations happened while I changed a light bulb in the hallway or vacuumed the apartment carpet. In the second week, I noticed that quite often I would end up staying longer than necessary just to continue chatting. He spoke little about himself, but showed genuine interest in the stories I told, about the other residents, about the curious situations I encountered day to day in the building. What was intriguing was that when Jonas mentioned something about his own life, it was almost always in the context of other people who had crossed his path, never about him. I'm used to dealing with reserved residents who don't feel comfortable sharing details of their past, especially with someone they've only known for a short time. So I wasn't surprised that, even after several conversations, I still knew very little about his personal history. What truly surprised me was the unexpected question he asked one afternoon while I was taking out the bathroom trash. "Do you want to know how I lost my arm?" He cast his gaze toward his empty right shoulder, and although I immediately understood what he was referring to, I had no idea why the question had come up like that. Trying to keep a casual tone, I answered, "From what I recall from your file, you were born without it, weren't you?" There was an underlying discomfort in me, a fear of touching on a sensitive subject or saying something that might hurt him in some way. The silence that followed made me think the conversation had come to an end, but then I saw him shake his head slightly. No, I know that's what they say, what's on the record, what everyone believes. But the truth isn't exactly that. It might sound crazy, but if you want to hear it, I'll tell you. If you don't, we can talk about something else, no problem." He smiled. His expression was calm, and I believed him when he said he wouldn't mind if I didn't want to know. But at the same time, there was something in his eyes that showed a deep desire to share that story. Going against an instinct that told me not to get involved, I ended up saying that I wanted to hear what had really happened to his arm. "I've known from the start that you probably won't believe me. That's fine. I've gotten used to it since I was a child. After some family arguments and visits to psychologists, I learned it was better not to talk about it. For most of my adult life, I never brought up the subject again. In fact, you're only the second person I've ever told this story to." He paused briefly before continuing. "The first was a girl I dated when I was, around 25. Her name was Emily. She was incredible in every way. There was a time when I really believed we would end up getting married. I wanted everything with her, but then I made the mistake of trusting her, of telling her what I'm about to tell you." He gave me an evaluating look before proceeding. "Have you ever seen someone stop loving you? I'm not talking about ordinary breakups. but actually witnessing the light in the other person's eyes fade away, as if the glow that illuminated you simply died. I hope you've never been through that. You're young, and I hope you never have to feel it. That's exactly what happened when I told Emily this story. Right then, at that moment, I saw something between us go dark forever. It was painful. But today, looking back, I realized that by revealing my secret, I did us both a favor. She did love me, but not enough. Not enough to stop herself from laughing, to contain her contempt, or to avoid leaving me less than a month later, inventing some excuse rather than admitting she couldn't stay with someone who, in her eyes, was just a madman. A man who claimed to have had his arm torn off by a creature. He sighed and looked away for a moment. Sorry, I'm rambling. The important thing is that today I no longer worry about what people think of me. Maybe I really am crazy. But crazy or not, I know I probably don't have more than 6 months to live. And you might be one of the last friendly people I meet on this path. I don't need you to believe me. I just ask that you listen. And don't laugh, all right? I nodded, and then he went on. Great. When I was 12 years old, I lived with my parents in a small town called Westerfield, one of those typical American country towns where almost everyone knows each other. It was about 3 hours east of here. I doubt you've ever heard of it. In the end, Westerfield was like any other small town place. 2 tiny movie theaters, some chain restaurants, lots of surrounding farms, and very few spots where kids our age could have fun without getting into trouble. I was friends with Dylan Mercer and Eric Dunham since 3rd grade. We weren't exactly model boys, but we weren't bad either. We did things like throw rocks at the train when it passed, or jump fences into forbidden areas just for the thrill of it. But nothing truly serious. We never hurt anyone. We were just bored kids. Halloween was, without a doubt, our most anticipated time of year. We still enjoyed knocking on doors asking for candy, even though we were already at the age when that was starting to seem childish. But what really excited us was the atmosphere of the night. Scary stories, pranks full of scares, the adrenaline of pretending we believed in something we knew was made up. We created our own legends, hidden bodies in abandoned houses, ghosts moving objects. But deep down, no one was really scared. The fun was in the attempt, in the tension, in the possibility that, maybe, something could be real. That's when Dylan told us about the thing that lived in Emerson Park. He said he heard the story from his older brother, who was in the army and had come home for a while. According to this brother, there was a homeless man living in the park, but he wasn't exactly human. He was something else, something that shouldn't exist. Of course, that made the park the most fascinating place in town for us. Emerson was a small, rarely visited park, located in an older area surrounded by shuttered shops and houses that were practically falling apart. I'd only been there once, still a child, when my parents tried to revisit some old memories, but the disappointment was so great that we never went back, and I never thought of going back until I heard that story. Our plan was simple. On Halloween, we were allowed to go trick-or-treating from 6 to 8 in the evening, under the condition that we stay together and not eat anything before getting home. Also, under no circumstances were we to stay out after 8. We did the math and concluded that we had enough time to go to the park and return, leaving 30 minutes to still get candy around the neighborhood. The only disagreement was about the order of things. Dylan and I wanted to go to the park first. Eric, on the other hand, insisted that we should secure the candy first. I suspected he was scared. The way his eyes widened when he heard the story made me believe that. In the end, he gave in and we headed to the park before doing anything else. When we arrived, the sun was already setting. The asphalt had deep cracks, the vegetation was neglected, and the bushes grew wildly, encroaching on the path. The place felt much gloomier than I remembered. As we approached the wooden bridge, crooked and worn by time, Eric nudged me and pointed at a rusty water fountain, thinking it might be the homeless man from the story. Dylan mocked him, but to be honest, I was nervous too. Everything about that place caused an uneasy feeling that was hard to explain. All I wanted was to finish this adventure quickly and leave without anyone calling me a coward. Today, thinking back, I realized that on some level, my brain had already picked up that we weren't alone. I don't know how or why, but I knew. And yet, we kept going. As we walked under the bridge, we heard footsteps behind us. None of us said anything, but we stopped and turned around. That was when Dylan let out a shout. In front of us there was something. At first glance it looked like a tall man, wearing a long poncho or overcoat with a hood. But, in the glow of our flashlights, we saw it was made of rot. Layers upon layers of damp earth, worms squirming around, the carcasses of small rotting animals mixed with trash. Its eyes were shards of green glass that glowed from within, as if some faint light illuminated them. And the worst part, when it opened its mouth, we saw long, sharp teeth, thin like silver needles. "Do you have something to offer me?" it asked. The voice did not sound like that of a man. It resembled the sound of strong wind before a storm. We took a step back, and the thing moved forward with a wobbly, hesitant gait. "Or are you going to waste my time?" it said, the voice like the distant howl of wind about to turn into a storm. Then we ran. The noise that came after us was horrible. Heavy footsteps, something wet and sticky dragging along the ground. In the blink of an eye, the creature caught up to Eric. I remember the slimy, worm-infested hand grabbing his shoulder. He let out a scream, but the sound was cut off halfway. Not because he ran off or was dragged away. He simply disappeared. As if the air around him had closed in, leaving behind only an eerie silence and an empty space where seconds before he'd been. That almost made me stop. It made no sense. It wasn't possible, but survival instinct was stronger. I kept running. For a moment, I only slowed down enough for Dylan to crash into me and knock us both to the ground. I was trying to get up when I heard another snap behind me. When I turned around, Dylan was also gone. No trace, no explanation. The ground where he had fallen was empty, as if he had never been there at all. The creature towered over me, the green eyes gleamed and the metallic teeth ground against each other, as if savoring what was about to happen. "Do you have something to offer me?" The question filled my ears, the sound passing through me as if it were more than just words. "Number I only have this." I was trembling. I lifted my candy bag, but it was empty. At some point I dropped my flashlight. I had nothing else. Or at least I thought I didn't. Then the thing grabbed my right arm. The feeling was strange, a mix of tingling and numbness. When I looked, my arm was no longer there. It simply didn't exist anymore. The bag fell to the ground, because there was no hand left to hold it. I touched my shoulder, smooth skin, no scar, no wound, as if I had never had an arm. "You may go." Its voice came out softer, almost satisfied. Then it turned around and vanished into the shadows. I ran home, where I burst in crying, babbling incoherently while my mother tried to understand what had happened. My father called the police. They believed I'd been attacked, but they dismissed any mention of a monster. Even stranger, no one seemed to know who Dylan or Eric were. There was no record of them, no memories, no family to identify them, as if they had never existed. I was taken to psychologists. They said my mind had created a story to deal with the trauma. Eventually, I learned to pretend I accepted that version, but I never believed it. Not even when I grew up and tried to convince myself it was just an illusion. Deep down, I always knew what really happened. He fell silent for a while, absent-mindedly playing with the utensils from the meal I'd brought him earlier. Then he looked at me again. "And that's how I lost my arm. Thank you for listening. Thank you for not laughing or sending me to a hospital. You're a good kid." Jonas died 4 weeks later. His wish was to be cremated and have his ashes sent to his mother, an elderly woman who still lived in Westerfield. He had no one else. His mother, in poor health, couldn't travel to arrange the funeral, so I offered to bring the ashes and be present at the small farewell ceremony. The trip was peaceful. Few people attended, but it was a nice moment. In the end, I hugged his mother and told her how much Jonas had meant to me. And it was true. He had been a friend. Even if I didn't believe the absurd story he'd told, I knew the world felt a bit emptier without him. It was late afternoon when I took the road back home. I had never been to Westerfield before, but as I drove, I couldn't help thinking about Jonas, his childhood there, the stories he held about Dylan and Eric, as if they were real. I knew it was all my mind's invention, but even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe it wasn't. Then my eyes caught sight of the Emerson Park sign, small, rusted, leaning to one side, but still legible. Before I realized what I was doing, I slowed down, put the car in reverse, and turned onto the street leading to the most run-down part of town. I went slowly, trying to convince myself it was a way to pay tribute to Jonas. But deep down, I just wanted to prove to myself that it was all fantasy. I parked in front of a twisted wire fence and without thinking much about it, slipped through. Dusk was falling fast, but there was still enough light to outline the gnarled trees and the overgrown grass taking over the park. The scene was exactly as I'd pictured when Jonas told me his story. The uneven path, the rusty drinking fountain, and in the distance, the crumbling bridge. I moved carefully, more concerned about snakes or any other animal that might be lurking in the vegetation than anything else. Still, with every step I took, my heart pounded faster. All I wanted was to reach the bridge, take a quick look, and leave before darkness completely set in. The cold started to intensify, and I was only a few steps away from the bridge when something changed. The shadows under the structure seemed to shift, or rather one of the shadows detached itself from the rest. I froze. It was exactly how Jonas had described it. A tall figure, hooded, covered by a long, worn cloak. I slowed down, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, searching for some logical explanation. But then the green eyes shone in the darkness, opaque like glass, yet deep, hungry. Below them, a pale glint sparkled, silver needle-like teeth where a mouth should have been. I didn't wait, I ran. I tore through the park without daring to look back. I vaulted the fence so hard I felt the air leave my lungs, but I didn't stop. I jumped into my car and sped off, driving like something was chasing me, nearly getting into accidents along the way. I only eased up when I got home. Only then did I notice I was shaking head to toe, cold sweat soaking my skin. It's been a few days and I should be feeling safe, but I'm not. And worse, I'm starting to go mad. I remember things that can't be real. I remember a woman named Lillian or something like that. I remember loving her. I have flashes of us together, as though we were laughing, talking. I can almost feel her touch, hear her voice. I remember our first date at a bowling alley, her introducing me to her parents, her standing by my side at Jonas's funeral. But Lillian never existed. She can't have existed. Maybe it's just my imagination, a trick of the mind trying to fill empty spaces. I know the human brain can create absurd illusions. A missing arm, a monster under a bridge, a girlfriend who was never there. Maybe I just need to rest, take a few days off work, go back to normal. Maybe then I'll stop imagining I heard a scream behind me when I jumped the fence at Emerson Park. Maybe then I'll stop thinking about the sharp snap that echoed in the air, that faint crack, as if something had just been erased from the world. And maybe, just maybe, I'll stop looking out my bedroom window every night, wondering whether I'll see, or not see, those green eyes watching me in the darkness. Waiting for the right moment to conclude whatever damn transaction was started that night in the park. Good evening, Dom. My name is Esteban Cruz. For over a decade, I was responsible for cleaning and maintaining a high school. I worked the evening shift, which meant my shift extended until around 10 at night, ensuring that the classrooms were organized after the students and teachers had already left. There were 2 senior year students who were known by everyone. They were absolutely identical, even wearing their hair the same way, loose, curly, always with a headband. They both had a charismatic and cheerful demeanor, always greeting me at the entrance, and it was clear that they had many friends. But one day, one of them lost her life in a motorcycle accident alongside her boyfriend, who studied at another school. The tragedy shook everyone. Teachers, staff, and classmates attended the funeral. I went to offer my condolences to the family and especially to the twin sister, who was devastated. In the following days, she didn't show up at school, something completely understandable. Then, on a Monday, I saw her walking down the hallway. She looked fragile, consumed by grief. What caught my attention was that she wasn't surrounded by her friends, which was unusual for her, but given the circumstances, I thought it was natural for her to want to be alone. I waved at her from a distance and gave a discreet smile. However, there was no response. She just kept walking, disappearing at the end of the hallway. I thought to myself, poor girl, and went back to work. The afternoon passed and soon it was night. The students had already left, and I had to wait for the building to empty before finishing cleaning the classrooms. The work usually took a long time because the rooms were always in a chaotic state. As usual, my shift would end around 10 at night, when only the school's security guard remained. On the second floor where I was, there was only one classroom left to clean. I took a quick break in the hallway to take a sip of my soda. That's when I heard footsteps on the stairs. I assumed it might be a teacher coming back to retrieve something forgotten, but strangely the footsteps suddenly stopped. No one appeared. Curious, I went to the stairs, but the lower floor was empty. Some lights were already off since I had finished cleaning there. I went back to continue working, but as I approached the last classroom, the footsteps echoed again. This time, when I turned around, I saw the twin standing in the middle of the hallway. Her face carried such deep sorrow that, for a moment, I was left speechless. What puzzled me was the fact that she was still at school at that hour, considering all the students had left long ago. I thought maybe her parents had been delayed in picking her up. So I asked, "Do you need anything? Do you want me to call your parents?" She didn't answer. She simply started walking backward, slowly, until she reached the staircase. Then, all of a sudden, she ran. My instinct was to follow her. When I reached the lower floor, I saw that she had locked herself in the girls' bathroom. I stood outside trying to help in any way I could. I offered my phone so she could call her parents, or she could give me their number so I could call them myself. No response. Only the sound of quiet sobbing from inside. At that moment I felt completely powerless. I had never experienced anything like that before and had no idea what to do. Given the situation, the only thing that came to mind was calling the principal. I had her number saved on my phone for emergencies, so I dialed. It rang twice, and on the third, she answered. While listening to the muffled crying coming from the girls' bathroom, I explained everything that was happening. The principal found the story odd. She said the girl's parents had requested a 2-week leave so she could undergo grief counseling. The girl was in a very delicate emotional state and was not supposed to be at school. I was stunned. I insisted that I had seen her enter and that at that moment she was in the bathroom, crying. The principal asked for a moment to call the parents and clarify the situation. I hung up and stayed there listening to the sound of sobbing from the other side of the door. Shortly after, my phone rang again. I answered immediately, but this time the principal's voice had changed. She spoke slowly, seriously. "Mr. Esteban, I just spoke with the girl's parents. She is at home. In fact, I just talked to her. The girl confirmed that she hasn't set foot in the school since her sister passed away." A chill ran down my spine. My heart pounded, and at that very moment the crying inside the bathroom stopped. I was still holding the phone to my ear, but I could barely hear the principal, who was trying to convince me that I must have mistaken her for another student. But I knew what I had seen. There was no mistake. The principal asked me to check who was inside. With trembling hands, I took out my set of keys, unlocked the door, and stepped in. The bathroom was completely empty. I checked each stall, one by one, and they were all open. No sign of anyone. And before anyone suggests that she could have escaped through the window, that would have been impossible. All the school windows had bars for student safety. It was at that moment that I understood. I had just experienced something that defied any logical explanation. The principal remained on the line, as unsettled as I was. After a brief silence, she simply told me to go home and rest and that we would talk later. I quickly gathered my things and left the building. At the exit, I met the security guard, a colleague with whom I always exchanged a few words. I asked if he had seen any student enter or leave after I started working. He said no. He told me that the last person to leave had been a teacher, and that after that, no one else had entered or exited, except for me. He wanted to know why I was asking, but I didn't have the strength to explain. I made up some excuse and left. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every detail of what had happened. The thought that the girl had somehow returned wouldn't leave my mind. Weeks later I saw her again. She walked through the hallways, sat on a bench as if waiting for someone. But it wasn't the surviving twin. I knew because since the funeral, the living twin had changed her hairstyle. I never found out if anyone else saw her or if it was just me. But she remained there. I saw her from time to time, until the day of my retirement. After that, I never went back to that school. That is my story. Thank you for listening. At the hospital where I worked for years as a janitor, it was common to see people with limited resources seeking medical care. Although it wasn't a public hospital, the director allowed those in the most vulnerable situations to be treated for a symbolic fee, or in some cases for free. Over time, this policy ended up attracting homeless people who frequently came in asking for help, food, or just a place to rest. This became a difficult problem to manage, leading to changes in the hospital's rules. Even so, a very elderly man still showed up from time to beg for money. I don't think they ever kicked him out because he could barely walk, and on some nights he would sleep on the hospital benches. It was a melancholic sight, and all the staff knew him. One morning, as I arrived for another shift, I saw that man sleeping outside. It wasn't unusual, so I went straight to work. A few hours later, while cleaning a more isolated area, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Since disoriented patients sometimes wandered into restricted areas, I went to check. But the hallway was empty. I found it strange, but I continued my tasks and moved on to the nearby restrooms. As soon as I entered the men's restroom, I saw a stall door closing at that exact moment, as if someone had just stepped inside. Following protocol, I was supposed to wait outside until the person finished so I could clean. Before leaving, however, I noticed the person's feet under the stall door, old pants and completely worn-out work boots. That immediately reminded me of the elderly man who used to come to the hospital. But there was one important detail. That area had restricted access. He wasn't supposed to be there. Worried that security might remove him by force, I decided to warn him. I called out to him, but there was no response. I crouched slightly to look under the door, and to my surprise, the feet were gone. I knocked a few times, but still no answer. Feeling a chill run down my spine, I decided to open the door. My heart pounded as I did. The stall was empty. Swallowing hard, I felt an almost uncontrollable urge to get out of there as fast as possible. I made up an excuse and went to the hospital's entrance. That's when I saw, on the benches outside, paramedics covering a body with a sheet. It was the same elderly man. He had passed away right there. At the time, I was terrified by what had happened. Today, when I think back on that day, fear has been replaced by another feeling: sadness. Maybe before leaving, he just wanted to say goodbye to the place that in some way had been a home to him. Before we get to the last story, if you're still here, let me know what time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing who sticks around until the end. Let's not stop now. On to the next. I come from a modest ranch on the outskirts of Celaya, a city located in the state of Guanajuato, Mexico. At the time, I was 23 years old. The harvest was not doing well, and financial difficulties forced me to seek an alternative in the city. There I had relatives, my uncles to be precise, who had been living in the area for quite some time. With great generosity, they welcomed me into their home and gave me shelter. I was already familiar with the place since we often visited, especially on weekends when we went to get supplies. So, it wasn't entirely an unfamiliar environment for me. However, I had never spent so much time away from the ranch, much less been separated from my parents. Even so, necessity spoke louder, and I didn't hesitate for a moment when this opportunity arose. My name is Victor Mendonza, and what I'm about to tell you is real. Believe me, I never imagined I would experience something like this. Despite growing up in the countryside, I was never one to believe in ghost stories or wandering souls. But life has its own peculiar way of teaching lessons. That night made me realize that not everything is a product of the imagination, and that the unexplainable can be far more real than we'd like to admit. With my uncle's help, I started looking for a job, and luckily, within 2 weeks, I found one. I was hired as a caretaker in an old building located in an area known for its high crime rates. Something that intrigued me was the building's owner himself, who, when signing the contract, mentioned that no one ever managed to stay there for long. But I didn't dwell on that detail. I needed a job, and that was all that mattered. I accepted immediately, and that same afternoon, they took me to see my new duties. I was assigned a small room on the first floor, simple with no great comforts, but suitable for me. In addition to janitorial tasks, I had to patrol the building during the night to ensure everything remained under control. The first few days passed without incident, but on the third night everything took an unexpected turn. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by violent knocks on my door, accompanied by the desperate cries of a man pleading for help. A chill ran down my spine, and I jumped up in shock and remained still in front of the door. With a tense voice, I asked who was there. Silence was my only answer. Uncertain, I walked to the window and looked outside, but I saw no one. Only a couple of neighbors were crossing the courtyard and entering the building. I didn't call out to them. I waited for a few minutes, listening for any other signs. Since nothing else happened, I decided to go back to bed, still uneasy about what had occurred. The next morning, I walked through the hallways to check if anything seemed out of place. There were no signs of a struggle or commotion. The residents didn't mention any disturbances either. To my surprise, even the couple I had seen that night gave no indication of having heard anything. They simply greeted me as usual. That same night after dinner, I went to bed, still dwelling on the fact that no one else had heard anything. No matter how much I tried to push the thoughts away, I couldn't understand how something so unsettling could have gone unnoticed. I tried to stay calm, but that night, it happened again. At exactly 4:25 in the morning, I woke up, or rather, I was woken up. The knocks echoed with the same force against the wooden door, accompanied by the same desperate cries. The male voice pleaded for help, carrying the same urgency, the same despair that had sent chills down my spine the previous night. I sprang out of bed in an instant, my heart pounding. This time the sound was so intense it seemed the door wouldn't hold for long. My instinct was to do what I had done before. Wait, observe, try to understand. But once again, silence returned, suffocating, as if no noise had ever existed there. Only this time I decided I wouldn't just stand there. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.